Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the International Society for the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect. We thank you for joining us today and appreciate all that you're doing to help children around the world during this challenging time. In February, Child Abuse and Neglect published a special issue called Child Trafficking, Global Healthcare Issues, Perspectives, and Solutions, co-edited by our presenter, Jordan Greenbaum. Today, Dr. Greenbaum will give an overview of the issue, which highlights the significant physical and mental effects of child trafficking and the need for professionals working with children to understand and address these effects. She will describe key studies and give examples of innovative counter-trafficking programs around the world. Please note that the special issue is available open access at the Elsevier website. I'll share the website address in the chat box shortly. Right now, I have everyone on mute to avoid background noise. We welcome you to enter any questions or comments you have in the questions box throughout the presentation. Jordan will answer questions at the end as time permits. Dr. Jordan Greenbaum is an ISPCAN counselor and child abuse physician based in Atlanta, Georgia. She is medical director of the Global Health and Wellbeing Initiative with the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and also medical director of the Institute on Healthcare and Human Trafficking at the Stephanie Blank Center for Safe and Healthy Children at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. Jordan, we thank you so much for being with us today and for your contributions to child protection. Now I will turn it over to you. One moment, please. Okay, we can see your slides. Maybe just make them presentation mode. Okay, we can't hear you speaking, Jordan. Hold on a moment, everyone. The internet is being challenged these days as well. Okay, we see your slides, but we don't have audio. Jordan, can you check your audio settings under the audio tab? Thanks for your patience, everyone. We're just having some technical difficulties with the sound.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, good, thank you. I'm so sorry, everyone. The internet is sketchy, and it's noon right now, so I think everybody logged on at noon, so I was cut off temporarily, but I think we solved the problem. I've joined by phone, and thank you for your patience. Shall I go ahead and get started, Heather?
Yes, please do.
Okay. So, Heather, thank you for introducing me. I basically am a child abuse physician, and I'm very interested in child trafficking around the world, and especially the healthcare aspect of it, how survivors access healthcare and what their healthcare needs are. And when I talk about healthcare, I want to make it clear I'm talking about both medical health and mental health care. So both areas are very important. And so because of this, because of this interest of mine, I got together with a team of people, and we created this special issue of Child Abuse and Neglect, which is the ISPCAN's journal. And we specifically asked people to submit studies that look at the intersection of child health and child trafficking, or to talk about their interesting programs that they're implementing around the world that address healthcare, either mental or medical health care for kids. And I'm hoping that through this issue and through today's webinar that we'll be able to share some ideas which might spark some collaboration between people who are listening and the authors of some of these articles, and there may be something generated out of it that will improve everybody's knowledge of child trafficking and healthcare. So let's just get started. I'm going to cover about 6 articles and programs very quickly, just giving you kind of a quick overview, a taste of what the articles are like. This one is called Behavioral Health Treatment Buy-in Among Adolescent Females with Histories of Commercial Sexual Exploitation. And buy-in in America, by the way, is refers to commitment, committing to doing something. I buy into having therapy. I commit to it. I'm engaged in it. So basically, this is a U.S.-based study, and they looked at adolescent girls who were confirmed victims of commercial sexual exploitation. And they basically said, we know around the world that children who are trafficked and sexually exploited tend to be traumatized. And they tend to have a lot of behavioral health issues, and many of them need some sort of treatment, be it some sort of a talk therapy or arts-based therapy, some sort of attention to their well-being. But it's very hard to engage them and get them sort of convinced to participate in mental health therapy. So they wanted to understand that better. They wanted to understand the attitudes from the child's perspective about their perspective of behavioral health and behavioral health treatment. So they interviewed 21 adolescent females, 15 to 19 years of age, and did these in-depth interviews and looked for themes. And they talked to them about, what are your views about what does mental health mean to you? What does substance use mean to you? What do you think about mental health providers? Those kinds of things, just to get a sense of their perspective. And when they asked them about attitudes toward behavioral health care, many of them had very positive things to say. They said, the providers can help me. I do get something out of it, and they listen, they're respectful of me, they don't judge, and I feel safe with them. But unfortunately, a lot of people sort of mirrored those positive with negative, reciprocal negative comments saying, they don't meet my needs, they don't seem to care, and I certainly don't trust them. As a sample of some of the quotes that were obtained from some of these kids, the green quotes are the positive ones. They poked me out of dark places. They showed me how to do things that are fun to do while you're sober, how to stay sober. Another one said about her therapist, she was good at meeting your needs. If you explain things to her, she would sit there and listen and help to find a solution. They'll casually talk to you like regular human beings, which kind of gets at that respect. They're treating me like a normal human being, not with any stigma. They're giving me respect, which is really an important point throughout these interviews. Some of the negative comments were things like, I never felt the need to be close to them. They aren't genuine. That is, they don't seem sincere. When you're not happy, they take you to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist gives you medication. So now you can just be deadened to the situation. Now you can't complain about how messed up it is. And another child said, they're just looking at their money. Like, as long as I have a kid, I sit in my office and I get paid. So I think it's really important that we are aware of some of these negative perceptions because there are things that are contributing to those negative perceptions that perhaps we can change. So when asking kids all about, these are some of the examples of the questions that they asked them, but they came up with a model for engaging youth in behavioral health therapy. And they essentially said, those kids who are engaged in commercial sexual exploitation are going to have a lot of trauma and probably have a lot of behavioral health symptoms. And they get an acute loss of control. Everybody else is controlling their lives, and they really feel it. And that's extremely important to them. They gain back this control. So that's going to be something that has to be taken into consideration. Other things to consider is their concept about mental health, what mental health is, and what substance abuse really means. If they've had behavioral health issues in the past, that's going to influence how they feel about healthcare providers, and it's also going to influence their perceptions about the severity of their own symptoms. So all of these things are important and are going to make up the factors that are going to play into buy-in. If we want to successfully engage some of these adolescents, we need to build trust. They will not commit unless they trust the provider and feel like the provider really cares and respects them. They feel like they have to have a system that's navigable. They don't like this very fragmented system that's very common in the United States among trafficked youth. They are passed off from one system to the next, child protective services and juvenile justice, and then foster care. And everywhere they go, they get a new therapist. It's very fragmented. They don't want that. And they want a system that encourages their autonomy, gives them respect, gives them choices, asks their opinion, and allows them to give informed consent, which means they want information to be informed, and then they want to be able to consent. And so if we do those kinds of things, we're more likely to get the buy-in for behavioral health engagement. Very interesting article, and admittedly, it's a very small sample in a very small area of the United States. We can't generalize it, but interesting and thought-provoking. The next one, we take a leap from the United States to the greater Mekong subregion, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And this is titled Post-Trafficking Stressors, the Influence of Hopes, Fears, and Expectations on the Mental Health of Young Trafficking Survivors in the greater Mekong subregion. Sorry, trying to get this. Okay. So basically, these researchers said, people talk a lot about the stressors and the trauma that children experience before and during trafficking as being extremely important factors that predict their mental health outcomes. And we know that trafficked children are very much at risk for depression and anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder. But we also need to think about the stressors that are experienced after the child leaves the trafficking situation and they're getting aftercare services. And we know from some studies that there are an awful lot of stressors out there, and we know from our own experience, these children are facing housing issues, they're facing possible stigma if they return to their villages, they're worried about the economics, money, jobs, all those kinds of things. And so we have to ask ourselves, how do these stressors contribute to the way these children are feeling and their mental health at the time they're receiving services? That's really important, and no one's ever really looked at that. So this was a cross-sectional study, again, in those three countries. And believe it or not, they did 517 face-to-face surveys. They must have had an army of interviewers, and just amazing. They interviewed kids who were 10 to 19 years of age who had just started aftercare services with one or more NGOs. So they're receiving services within the last 2 weeks they'd come on board. And then they asked them about their experiences before and during trafficking, things like violence, coercion, abuse, the time in trafficking, things that would be expected to be influencing their mental health. You need to control for that. They asked them about their future plans and the concerns they were experiencing. And then they had tests for depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Specifically, they used the Hopkins Symptoms Checklist for depression and anxiety and the Harvard Trauma Questionnaire Part 4 for PTSD. So they had a lot of information on these kids, and then they broke them down into genders. These are some of the questions that they asked them, so you can get a sense of how they gathered this information. Do you worry about how people might treat you when you arrive home? Getting at that stigma and that cultural ostracism. Do you worry that your trafficker may try to hurt you or your family? What are your most important concerns, or what problems come to your mind most often? And this was a closed answer question. They gave them a series of possible answers regarding their health, their family's health, jobs, economic status, fear of trafficker, guilt or shame, worries about documents, etc. And then finally, another closed-ended question, what is your best hope for the future? And the choices there were, I have hope for money, hope for my family, a job, I get to go home, I get to get married, or I have no hope at all. So those were the possibilities. Let's look at some of the results. Again, 517 kids, about a 4-to-1 ratio of girls to boys. Average age, about 16 years. And you can see that the majority of girls were sex trafficked, while the majority, about 2/3 of the boys, were labor trafficked in these top 3 labor industries. Fishing is a big area of labor trafficking in Southeast Asia, as well as factory work and begging. The average duration of trafficking was about 5.3 months, but there was a fairly big range. When they looked at mental health symptoms, which are going to be influenced by the child's whole life, not just the aftercare, but the trafficking and pre-trafficking experiences as well, they found high levels of anxiety, depression, and PTSD. So you can see that for boys, which are the gold bars, and girls, which are the blue bars, the mid 30, say 36 percentile or so for anxiety for each of them. Girls were more likely than boys to screen positive for depression, over 50% of girls, about 37% of boys. And then about equal percentages of girls and boys had post-traumatic stress disorder, about 26, 27%. So this is a large proportion of kids in each of these areas that have significant symptoms. When they broke them down by gender, boys versus girls, they looked at gender differences. Are boys concerned about different things than girls are? And everywhere you see an asterisk, that's going to be represents a statistically significant difference between girls and boys. So, for example, girls were statistically more worried about treatment by others when they came home to their home village, stigma and ostracism. They were significantly more worried about that than boys were, although significant numbers of both kids and both genders were concerned. Not much difference in the fear of the trafficker or money earning ability. They both groups had similar levels of fears about that, but they did vary about their own physical health and family health. Girls were somewhat more concerned about those two issues than boys. And the guilt and the shame is interesting. About 57% of girls felt that was a big concern of theirs, while only about a third of boys. When you ask them, well, what are your hopes for the future? Both boys and girls ranked jobs and having money as the biggest hope for the future. It was a really big concern. And I think what this study shows us is that there is an impact on mental health related to a child's concerns that they're feeling when they're getting their aftercare services, and that this has to be taken into consideration because that's going to impact their levels of depression, anxiety, and PTSD. And that if we really want to adequately treat children, we need to have a very holistic approach that addresses some of these concerns. We can't expect to treat their mental health symptoms in a silo or in isolation, which may be very obvious to you, but it's not obvious to a lot of people. So I think it's a good study. After adjusting for the co-variates, remember they wanted to control for things like the amount of violence that the child experienced while they were trafficked or the length of time they were trafficked, because those are really big influencers of mental health outcome. They found that for boys, even when you controlled for all those variables, they still found that worries about treatment by others, that is stigma, that the boys were concerned about when they returned to the village, affected anxiety, depression, and PTSD levels, as well as concerns about their own mental health predicted all of those outcomes. Interestingly, concerns about religion was something that predicted anxiety levels in boys. Girls were somewhat different. Their worries about stigma by others really predicted depression more than anything else. And family health, family money issues predicted depression as well. And they were more likely to be anxious about the fear of the trafficker than the boys were. So there were some interesting gender differences in the study. Okay, let's move on to the third study. This is a longitudinal evaluation of a survivor mentor program for child survivors of sex trafficking in the United States. So we're back now again to looking in the United States at sex trafficking of minors, anyone less than 18. So one of the things I like about this study is it's one of the few that I know about that does a formal, very rigorous evaluation of an intervention program. And I think that's what we desperately need, is for the wonderful work that's being done all around the world to have formal evaluation studies like this one. And that's why I picked this one to talk about, because I thought it was just very interesting the way they set it up. Okay, so the program is called My Life, My Choice. If any of y'all are from America, you probably have heard of My Life, My Choice. And it's a mentor program. So each child who has been confirmed as having been commercially sexually exploited, or somebody thinks they're high risk, those are the two groups of kids, they are each assigned a mentor who themselves is a survivor of commercial sexual exploitation. And that survivor has to have been out of the game for at least 5 years, I believe. So they've had a lot of time to be trained and sort of deal with their own issues. And they serve as mentors. And they provide individualized services according to what the child needs. But there's some set rules, like in the beginning, the mentor and the child meet weekly for every week, and then eventually it becomes a little less often, and it can continue on for years. It's not time limited. So a child may have the same mentor for 4 years. The services tend to be individualized, what that child needs. The mentor might accompany them to appointments and try to, help them with school or whatever the child needs, as well as being an emotional mentor. And that's the big role of the mentor, is to try to help the child who is being exploited actively get out of the exploitation and recover. And for those who are at risk, to sort of back away from the brink of exploitation and become resilient and safe and healthy. And the whole premise of this program is sort of based on Marlow's, pyramid of needs, I think. You'd think I'd know that after getting hammered with it in college. But anyway, Maslow had this hierarchy of needs where he felt like if you were going to be self-actualized, the 4 people in the world who are self-actualized, you have to satisfy a lot of more basic needs have to be met. So your physiological needs are the most important thing. And in dire straits, that's what people concentrate on. That's the most basic need. But once you've got your food, your shelter, and your drink, the things you look for are safety, love and belonging, and self-esteem. And you can't be self-actualized if you don't have these things. So My Life, My Choice focuses on those 3 areas: safety, love and belonging, and self-esteem. And that's where the mentors are sort of pushing that. They're not simply acting as bus drivers to take the child from one place to the next, their appointments. They're really helping the child to develop a sense of self and self-esteem and belonging. Okay, so that's the point of the program. The evaluation consisted of surveys that were done at the time the child entered the program, 6 months later, and 12 months later. Now, again, this isn't necessarily at the end of the program, because the program could go on for years, but they had these 3 times where they completed the survey, and they got a bunch of information. You can see they asked about recent commercial sexual exploitation. Had you been commercially exploited in the last, I can't remember, it was a month or 2 months or whatever, some time period. Sexually explicit behavior that the child engaged in recently. And sexually explicit behavior referred to sexual behavior that didn't necessarily involve physical touch. So it would cover things like stripping in an exotic dancing club, for example, or posing for nude pictures. They also asked if the child had been propositioned for commercial sex, which is an extremely high-risk situation. They asked about dating abuse, and then high-risk, quote, delinquent behavior, like using drugs, criminal behavior, whether they've been arrested. They asked about their health, recent sexually transmitted infections, and then mental health was very sort of crude measurements of sadness and hopeless feelings. And then they looked at strengths, the level of social support from others, the child's coping skills, and any hopefully positive changes in engagement in risky behaviors. So and they assessed that 3 different times. There were 41 initial youth enrolled in the study, but only 21 of those completed all 3 of the screens. So that's a limitation right there. It's a small study. That's okay. Average age 15.6 years. The vast majority were female. So again, that's going to be a limitation of the study. Most of them are heterosexual, and most of them were enrolled in school at the time that they were enrolled in the study, in the My Life, My Choice. Here's the breakdown of race and ethnicity, as you can see, and this is in the northeast of the United States. I think is where this was done. These are the major results. If you look at baseline versus 6 months versus 12 months, there was a very good drop in the amount of commercial sexual exploitation that the child had recently experienced. So at baseline, 72% of them said, yep, I was doing the commercial sexual exploitation. Well, I probably didn't use those words. But by the 12 months, it was down to 14%. That's excellent. That's really amazing. Also, after 6 months of service, they found statistically significant differences in sexually explicit behavior that had dropped significantly. Drug use had dropped. Delinquent behaviors had dropped, and times children who had been arrested or detained by law enforcement had all dropped significantly statistically. They also found an increase in social support around the child, and the child's coping skills had improved after 6 months of being in this program. Then when they looked at 12 months, because you really want to do a little bit longer term change in behaviors, there was some bounce back. They still showed a statistically significant decrease in delinquent behavior and arrests, but there was some bounce back in sexually explicit behavior and drug use, so it was no longer statistically significant from baseline. But they did find the continuous increase in coping skills, which is what we really want to see, as well as the decrease in commercial sexual exploitation. So basically, it showed that the program showed a statistical improvement in in commercial sexual exploitation, improvement in coping skills, and decrease in delinquent behavior and arresting episodes of arrest. For the rest of the time, I'd like to talk about a couple of programs that we received submissions for, program descriptions, intervention programs that people are implementing around the world that seemed particularly interesting. And while most of the programs included in this section of the special issue did not have formal evaluations like the study we just looked at, they still are extremely interesting, have a lot of promise, and I'm hoping that by giving them some visibility, people will say, hey, I'd like to help evaluate that program and maybe get some collaboration going, as well as share some ideas about what might work in your neck of the woods. So this first one is the trafficking program is Co-Variates, it's an organization, their model called Sampurnada. Co-Variates is a women-led organization that uses dance movement therapy to address several large issues: mental health, gender equality, and livelihood development. And they are focused in India, although they've done some work in Nepal and Bangladesh as well. So that's kind of the basic Co-Variates organization. And they created the Sampurnada dance movement therapy strategy to address sexual violence and to address marginalized populations. And what they do is they've created this program and they bring it out into the community. So it's out in the community or at schools or at psychiatric hospitals or at, say, shelters for trafficked persons. And so they take it out on the road. And they embrace the 4 core principles of dance movement therapy: the creative methodology, body-based methodology, going beyond that hegemony of verbal creation, and then finally experiential methodology. And they include a lot of Indian dance forms such as hand gestures, footwork, healing touch, yoga, breathing techniques, the 9 emotions. Those kinds of things are integrated into all of it. And the therapy addresses the physical, the cognitive, and the social needs of trafficked persons or other persons experiencing sexual violence. They've worked, the organization has worked with 50 different organizations and governments across South Asia. So they're really having an impact. And this is kind of the core activities of each dance movement therapy session. So it begins at the top at 12 o'clock. You can see there's some opening rituals. They warm up. Needs-based therapeutic activity that is unique to the needs of that particular group. It's a group exercise. Then they have some relaxation, healing touch, a closing ritual, and then they have some group discussion. So there is a verbal component to this where they debrief, they talk about what they felt, what they experienced. But most of it is a very experiential, nonverbal part of the therapy. For the groups that address former trafficked persons, they tend to keep them smaller than the average group, so no more than 10 people, so that there can be, and 2 facilitators, so there can be a lot of sort of intimate discussion and intimate looking at individual experiences. The program designers say we have a lot of strengths to this program. One is that it really creates cohesive and empowered environments. You look at the people in your own group, the 10 women or girls in your own group, I think this is mostly females, So there's some cohesiveness among the group that works together, but also all of these groups and survivors who are going through these groups kind of have their own community. And part of that is even strengthened by the fact that Kolkata allows a lot of the survivors who've been through the dance movement therapy to then train to become therapists and facilitators. And so there's a sub-community of trainers who grew out of this program. Another strength of it is that it doesn't require major infrastructure. It's not like you need a whole building to do, in computerized technology, this and that. You basically need a room and you need some good facilitators. And so they can take it on the road and go into areas like psychiatric hospitals or like shelters and bring the resources to the area. It's accessible to people with limited education or people who are very shy, may not have either the vocabulary or the confidence to talk about things verbally. They may not, some children, some adults may not be able to express their emotions verbally. So this is a different way of sort of accessing emotions, releasing the emotions, and gaining more control over the body and the mind. We've talked about survivors becoming DMT practitioners, and they've made a great effort, this group has, Kolkata Sangha's made a great effort to ground their program in academia. So they've done a lot of collaborative work with the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, and I believe, not absolutely sure, but I believe they're publishing or have published a study looking at the outcomes and the impact of this program. So they're giving it a lot more academic grounding than many programs. They say, well, there are some challenges. Some of that is that the practitioners who are leading some of these groups have their own residual traumatic stress, so they go to great lengths to encourage self-care, self-examination, peer support, mentoring of the facilitators so they can deal with that residual stress. There is a general cultural lack of acceptance of creative arts therapies as somehow not being legitimate, so they've had to fight that. But again, they've addressed that in part by grounding it in academia, which I think has given it a lot of status. And the fact that they've been working with governments and major organizations has given it a lot more status as well. They say that measuring impacts is extremely difficult. And I think, as we all know, if we work with trafficked youth, that this is a transient population. It's very hard to follow up with people. It's hard to have a trafficked person perhaps complete the whole program. They might be back out and gone, or they're lost to follow up. And then finally, funding is a constant issue. So I think this is an interesting article. The next one is called RPAN. RPAN is a mental health organization that is providing long-term psychotherapeutic intervention. They're collaborating with a rehabilitation home for female adolescents who have been commercially sexually exploited or sexually abused. And that rehab home is called the Advait Foundation, and they're collaborating with RPAN. RPAN provides the clinical therapist for the long-term psychotherapeutic intervention. So this is a program for youth 13 to 17 years of age. And it's interesting in that it provides a psychotherapeutic intervention for the survivors of exploitation and abuse, but it also aims to build the capacity of staff so that the rehab home becomes much more trauma-informed and trauma-free. So it's got two aims. One is direct services to providers, and the other is capacity building of staff, which is really, I think, unique and interesting. So let's look at this. The program structure for the direct intervention, the therapy for the residents, is based on a group therapy approach. They have weekly group sessions that last 2 to 3 hours for the residents, and during those sessions, they provide psychoeducation about trauma and traumatic stress, etc., skill building in identifying emotions, emotional regulation, for example. They have various need-based interventions according to the group, and they use a composite of different therapeutic strategies. The therapist is a licensed counselor. They're trained in trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. which is probably very familiar to a lot of Americans in this audience. But they also use arts-based therapies and different things that can be useful when combined. Very interesting. They used to have some individual counseling to supplement the group sessions, but over the last 3 or 4 years, they said they focused more and more on the group sessions, using individual counseling only for crises. So a child may have a series of 3 or 4 crisis individual appointments to get them through that crisis, but then be integrated, back into the group only session. So that's the direct service to the clients. For building the capacity of the staff is a whole nother thing, again, group-based education on things like child development, attachment theory, impact of trauma, the neurobiology of trauma, how to respond to a crisis situation in a trauma-informed way, essentially building skills and building knowledge of the staff to make it a trauma-informed organization. Excuse me. They've had annual evaluations of their program, but then 2 formal evaluations. And this is interesting. One was done in 2015, one was done in 2018. Both of them involved gathering information directly from resident interviews with the adolescents. So in 2015, they interviewed 19 clients, and they asked them about whether they thought the group therapy was useful on a Likert scale from 1 to 5. 1 is no, it's not useful at all. 5 is it's very useful. And about 17 out of 19 said they rated it as 4 or 5 useful. So that was good. They said that, the most helpful thing was learning how to manage my emotions and understanding my emotions and why I have them and, how it's related to trauma and such. So that emotional understanding and regulation, psychoeducation and emotional regulation were big. All of the clients reported a positive shift in at least one aspect of their life. And positive shift was defined things like knowing how to keep yourself safe, knowing how to maintain a safe relationship, being more confident in expressing their needs and seeking help. Really key behaviors, actually, and knowledge for kids. And so they reported significant increases in at least one of those or other areas. So they did another evaluation in 2018, again, interviewed a bunch of clients, and found generally it wasn't too clear exactly how this evaluation was done. We would have to read the specific report, I think, to get real details of how this was measured. But they found improvements in reported self-control, managing impulsive thoughts and actions, so not getting so angry and lashing out, for example. The kids said that they were better able to identify trauma triggers and deal with them, and they were better able to ask for help when they needed it. So again, some positive outcomes coming out of that program. And I really like the idea that they're working on 2 fronts, direct intervention and capacity building. They said that the strengths of this program were exactly that they're working with staff and youth at the same time, and that the therapist from RPAN is trauma trained, a licensed counselor who's got a lot of training in TFCBT and other things, and so is able to, has a lot of experience with trauma. And there's a lot of coordination and creativity between RPAN and the AdVait organization that we have home to make things work. How are we going to get around this problem or that problem? And they make changes. So they work very well together. The challenges, they say, have been resident turnover, which is reminiscent of the challenges we saw in other studies and other programs where it's very difficult to follow up because kids are lost to follow up. So resident turnover makes it difficult. They're always getting new clients in. So one of the ways they handled that was to have 2 groups instead of 1. They had 2 groups. So one group was the new people who had all sorts of sort of crisis issues that are typical for somebody newly arrived in a program. And the other group was for more seasoned residents who were moving on to other types of problems. So there was some ability to adjust for that, being creative. They said another difficulty was if a member of the staff left, there was some turnover. That was really hard because the culture is kind of a close culture within that organization. So losing somebody is a real loss for people. And then finally, the initial lack of a child protection policy when the therapist arrived made it difficult for him or her to sort of establish a positive discipline climate in the rehab center, because there was no policy to sort of fall back on. So that was a challenge. Those are the main challenges, though. Finally, I'd like to switch gears again. Now we're going to move to a program called Relentless, which takes another approach to serving children and improving health. Their aim of this Relentless is the name of the organization. Their aim is to help survivors of human trafficking, adults and children, seek liberty through health and improve accessibility so that all survivors have access to good, high-quality health care. That's their aim, and they go about it not by providing direct services, but by equipping professionals, all sorts of different professionals working with children who have been trafficked, helping them to develop holistic approaches that include health components in their interventions. So they're integrating health and safety into their interventions. So they provide consultation to organizations, and they provide trainings to the professionals. And they work with a variety of organizations, some organizations that work on human trafficking prevention, trafficking outreach, identification, victim service organizations, all different types of organizations, and they provide healthcare-focused training and consultation. So they're not training on just anything. They tend to train on things like sexually transmitted infections, sexual health, reproductive health, trauma-informed care, self-care, mental health issues, things that have to do with medical and mental health care. They provide on-site workshops and retreats for organizations. They provide lectures, conference plenaries, and they provide some online training as well. So there's a variety of different platforms that can be used to get their help, and they provide organizational consultations as well. So this is a great organization, and it's looking to build capacity around the world. They are a small organization, but they are one of the few organizations that focuses on healthcare among trafficked persons. And I love that. It's right up my alley. I think it's really good to have them exclusively focused on that. They're small, they're mobile, they can travel extensively. So they have been able to reach a lot of organizations, and I believe that much of their reach now is in Southeast Asia and Europe, probably other parts of Asia as well. But they are really able to move around and deliver a lot of consultations and trainings. The staff is very experienced in healthcare and human trafficking, so they are very, very knowledgeable. Their challenges in monitoring and evaluation, they've not had a formal monitoring evaluation study of this, but are looking into doing that. And they say that another difficulty is this constant stream of new research, new information that's bombarding the field, and we're probably all very familiar with that, just feeling like every time you turn around, there's something new coming out, and it's hard for us, all of us, as professionals to keep up. And so I think a lot of people in NGOs feel overwhelmed by this amount of information, and how can they possibly keep up with the latest trends in mental health care and also look at the new changes in immigration law or something. You know, it's just very overwhelming. So it's hard for organizations to stay up to date, and that is one of the challenges for Relentless as well. They have to stay up to date, and they have to provide the updates to everybody else. One of the things I thought was was a really good take-home recommendation that the author gave, and I think it's a good way to sort of end this talk, is she said, you know, it's very tempting for individuals and organizations to want to be everything for everybody. They want to respond to everybody's need, and people are always willing to say what they give them ideas for more services they provide. So it's very easy for you find yourself or your organization overextended. So you're just stretched too thin. You're not doing anything particularly well, and you're expanding beyond, offering services beyond your strengths and capacities. And so what we really need to do is stay focused. So, for example, Relentless is focused on healthcare. They don't do other things, they do healthcare. And I thought that was a very good reminder for all of us, because I certainly have fallen victim to the I want to do everything for everybody syndrome, only to find myself bashing into a brick wall. So I thought it was good advice from a really interesting author. These are just 6 out of the maybe 30 different articles that were available in the special issue, which again, you can download for free the whole issue. But basically, it kind of brings home a few key concepts that things in the anti-trafficking field are really changing fast. 25 years ago, there was almost no research, peer-reviewed research on trafficking. Now it's just everywhere. And just for me to keep up with the healthcare aspect is a full-time job, much less all the other areas that are doing research and trends are being monitored, things are being studied. So it's really changing fast. We have a lot to learn about physical, behavioral, and mental health of child trafficking victims and survivors. And we are sort of getting a sense of the problems that they experience from their trafficking, the mental health problems, the physical problems, but we are a long way from really knowing how to treat them and how to do it effectively in a trauma-informed way that's going to really be relevant, culturally relevant to kids in their families and communities. You've got a lot of exciting research, and I hope that your wheels are turning in your mind thinking, how can I use this information? Maybe I can collaborate with these people in this study or that study, or at least use information that might help. There are lots of creative and innovative programs. These are just a handful of them, but people are doing fantastic things around the world, really, really amazing things. So I want to emphasize that as well. But we really need to push forward together. We need to share what we're doing, and so that somebody in the United States doesn't have to reinvent the wheel on dance movement therapy, something that's already been done in India, and we can sort of learn from each other and validate in different cultures. How can DMT be used in Europe or be used in Latin America? How can it be tweaked so that it's useful there, or will it be useful there? Those kinds of things are something that we can only do if we collaborate. And I'm going to get off my soapbox right now and just leave you with a question. Who out there wants to collaborate? Because I'm all over it. If you guys want there, you just call on me, and this is how you get in touch with me. I'm glad to answer questions. I'm glad to collaborate. I'm glad to answer questions now, but if you have ones after this session ends, don't hesitate to reach out, because I always learn something when people ask me to look up something. If I don't know the answer, I'll find somebody smart who does, and I'll get back to you. And that's my story. Heather?
Thank you so much, Jordan, for sharing this really great information and insight. We do have several questions, and so I'm just
Oh,
going to
good.
start. Kind of speaking of, referring to all these programs you're mentioning, we have an attendee here named Monica who's asking about generally, how can these great programs be scaled up or replicated? She's asking specifically about the dance therapy program, and she says, are any universities offering this so that programs can become available throughout the country? I think dance departments, for example, would be open to this, and maybe even an elective for other healthcare majors with an interest in dance therapy.
Monica, I don't know where you're from, but that sounds like a great idea, and a great idea to go to some of the universities with dance therapy departments and other organizations. I know that there's a fair amount of dance therapy research being done, at least in the States, and I don't know about Europe and elsewhere, but there is a whole movement on that. And so I think some of these organizations would probably be very interested in talking to Kokata Sanbed about their techniques and how they might adapt their DMT to have a similar program, and how it might be used in a different cultural setting with different resources. I think it would be really a consultation mostly with Kokata Sanbed and say, how did you do it? What were you, exactly what did you do? And then going to universities that have a lot of clout, that always helps. I love that idea.
Okay, great. Thank you. Here's another question. I'm just going to read it. It's a bit long. Child trafficking is a very sensitive area of research, especially when it involves very young participants. Hold on one moment. It skipped down here a little bit. Okay, sorry. Would you please share some of the ethical concerns in conducting such research and research approach to such a young group? In other words, does it always, sorry, my questions are skipping around. Hold on one second. Sorry. Does it always involve a relevant professional or practitioner or report of a program. The reason I am asking this is I think it would be interesting to have a study on the various experiences of the practitioners or volunteers who work with the child trafficking survivors.
Yeah, that's such an excellent thing. It's kind of a two-part question. There are ethical issues working with child survivors, and so we have to be extremely careful. And there's what was it? Nexus Institute just published a whole thing on gathering data with child trafficking, the ethical issues related to safe research, which is extremely good. And I think ECPAT might have also done something on that. But there are issues like making it very, very clear to the child that it's entirely voluntary, that they can stop at any time or choose not to answer questions. They can answer one question or no questions or all the questions and stop at any time. We need to make it really clear that there's no apparent coercion or sort of bribing by giving them a lot of gifts or somehow that would make them feel like they have to participate. So keeping in mind those issues about the voluntary nature, lack of coercion, making sure that the children feel like they really know why you're going to use the information, and it isn't just to sort of have the information, but how that's going to be used. I think it's really important. If we're going to get information, we need to use it in a responsible way, so they need to know that. And then a lot of people say, and I think this is a really good point, that while many people worry about a child being traumatized talking about their experiences, that might be, but you also see a lot of children who say, after they've been interviewed, they said, this felt really good. The first time I really talked about it, you really cared. Nobody's ever asked me about this. And so you can look at it either way. In many cases, children will feel like it is a sign of respect if somebody wants to hear them, and they're able to sort of grow from this experience. But we would certainly need to be aware that if the child has the opposite reaction and is triggered, that they know they can say something, and we have resources for them to, like a counselor or some sort of mental health expert who would be ready to deal with that, with any discomfort or even crisis. And then your other question was talking to providers and people who volunteer or serve trafficked persons. And that's a whole other body of literature. A lot of research is done with direct involvement of survivors, and the other half is done interviewing people who serve them. And we get a tremendous amount of information that way. And I think that is a lot easier to get through your IRB, for one thing. And it's extremely helpful. We recently did a study interviewing people around the world who are victim service providers and NGOs, and learned so much from them about their perspectives about their kids, what was important, what was the challenge, what was the problem, what did they do well, what did they need. And so I think you can get, if you have an organized interview, semi-structured interview, you can gather a whole lot of really good information. So there's a lot to be gained from both types of research.
Okay, terrific. I'm going to ask a question. This is from Diane in Indonesia, and it's a question about kind of what happens after therapy or when therapy doesn't work. She says, my research is about sexually exploited girls in West Java. I found that at some points therapy and all that are not helping if they're still living surrounded by an exploitative environment. Many of them come back to their predators, and this time they're no longer children. Do you have studies or examples of kinds of programs that can prevent girls and women from falling back into the same sexual exploitative work?
And that is the million-dollar question. I don't know of studies that show successful therapies that measurably, over the long term, reduce re-victimization. It's not to say that work isn't being done, but I haven't seen any research on that. It's extremely hard to do follow-up studies of aftercare when children or adults go back to their home communities, but people do know exactly what you just said, that the risk of re-exploitation is extremely high, and whatever successful programs there are the ones that are very holistic and say we can't just have this child in the middle of a city in Cambodia getting therapy in the shelter and then leave the shelter and go home to their village in the rural area with no support and all of the problems of poverty, et cetera, there. That's not going to work. It's just begging for a disaster. And so I think that what ultimately is going to have to to be considered is ways to bring support into the community and the family once the child is returned, whether that's through traveling nurses or people in the community who provide support and care to be sort of the support of that child and that family, and work to change cultural beliefs and stigma. I don't know what the answer is, but as far as I know, nobody's solved that problem.
Okay, thank you.
And I would love to hear your thoughts on that, actually. I'd love to hear them.
Yes. Great, thank you. We do have a couple questions, and I don't know what information you have on this. Have you seen any emerging data during the time of COVID-19 related to trafficking? Or can comment on maybe how anti-trafficking work has changed, in the past couple months?
I'm so glad you asked. Yeah, there's a lack of real quantitative data at this point because we haven't had long enough to be able to gather that data. But there is impressive quantitative data showing that online commercial child sexual exploitation is way up. There's a lot more hotline reports, a lot more sex offender sites having activity on them. So there's a big jump in that, and that, of course, is a big risk factor for trafficking. It's the way people can recruit for trafficking. I have been very concerned about the risk of trafficking being exacerbated by the efforts to mitigate the coronavirus, the social distancing. Businesses are shutting down, schools are shutting down, so that makes incredible financial stressors for families around the world who may be just on the brink of poverty or in the throes of poverty already, and that might drive them to accept labor contracts that are exploitative, or allow their child to do, or ask their child to do live stream webcam sexual exploitation, those kinds of things. So I think that the financial stressors imposed by the mitigating efforts of the COVID crisis are exacerbating the risk. And I think that also having people at home where they're in the dysfunctional homes where there's a lot of violence already or sexual abuse, that is just making it more stressful for the child, and they may be even more likely to run away from home, which makes them at risk for trafficking. It also allows sex offenders more time at home to offend on some of the family members. So I think all of those things are exacerbating the risk of both labor and sex trafficking. People are desperate, so they accept conditions of work that are just really exploitative.
Okay, thank you. We're getting close to time. I just wanted to share one more comment from an attendee in Africa who said that she's wondering about any studies on this coming out of Africa, and she's interested in a future special issue that may include Africa.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And there's some great studies in Africa about a lot of studies about street-based youth and sexual exploitation of street-based youth, and lots of really good work coming out of that. And so I'm not sure whether some of these are in the special issue or not, but they do have a lot of good programs there. And there is some work done for child soldiers as well, on therapy and for treating the mental health of former child soldiers and reintegration into their communities and the effects of being involved in being a child soldier, the mental health and physical effects as well. So there's really good research coming out, particularly in those two areas.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. And hopefully those are being published not just in the special issue, but in other issues of child abuse and neglect. We often get studies out of African countries. So, yeah.
Okay, great.
And I would encourage you to submit, please.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jordan. And just a reminder again to the audience, if we did not get around to your question, our apologies. Jordan's email is here on the screen, so you can contact her directly if you'd like to talk with her more about your question. And I'm going to switch the screen back for our conclusion here. One moment. Okay, so thank you again, everyone, for joining us today, and Jordan for providing this really important information. ISPCAN invites all of you to visit our COVID-19 resources page at ispcan.org to access a variety of resources for different disciplines as well as for parents and children around COVID-19. You will also find information about our upcoming COVID-19 related webinars, including a special webinar next Tuesday, May 19th, presented in Italian on effective online intervention strategies for children, and another webinar on May 21st on the impact of COVID-19 on the online sexual exploitation of children, presented by the We Protect Global Alliance. So please check ispcan.org for that information. And a reminder that a recording of this webinar and a PDF version of the slides will be available on ispcan.org within 24 hours. We encourage all of you to become a member of ISPCAN if you're not already, so that we can continue having webinars like these in the future. If you're interested in presenting a webinar or have ideas for topics, please contact us at resources@ispcan.org. And we thank you all again for joining us today, and hope that you stay safe and stay strong during these challenging times, and that you have a great day or night, depending on where you are. Thank you again, Jordan.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. And thanks, Heather.
Okay. Have a good day. Bye.
Bye-bye.